The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee. Mom's voice was shaky, different from her usual confident tone that commanded respect in every room she entered. "Your father's gone, Sarah," she said, and the words hit me like cold water. Dad had been sick for months, but we all thought he'd pull through. He always did. I drove straight from Boston to our family home in Concord, the same route I'd taken countless times as a kid. The maple trees lining Elm Street were turning red and gold, but everything felt gray. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled like the lavender candles Mom lit when she was stressed. My brother Michael was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. He looked up with red eyes and gave me a hug that lasted longer than usual. "There's something we need to talk about," Mom said, after we'd all cried together on the living room couch. She pulled out Dad's will, the one he'd updated just 6 months ago without telling any of us. I remember thinking it was strange that he'd been so secretive about his lawyer visits, always saying it was just routine business stuff. The reading was straightforward until we got to the property section. Dad had left the family house to Michael, along with the lake cottage in New Hampshire where we spent every summer growing up. To me, he left his stock portfolio and some savings bonds. It sounded fair enough until Mom explained the numbers. The house was worth nearly $800,000, and the cottage another $300,000. My inheritance was maybe $60,000 total. Michael shifted uncomfortably when he saw my face. "Sarah, I had no idea," he said. But something in his voice made me wonder if that was completely true. Dad had always been closer to Michael, especially after Mike decided to stay in Massachusetts and work for the family construction business, instead of moving to California like I did. "Did you know about this?" I asked him directly. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Michael looked at Mom, then back at me, and I saw the answer in his hesitation before he even spoke. "Dad mentioned he was thinking about keeping the properties in the family business," he said quietly. "But I thought he meant both of us would inherit together." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about Dad's disappointment that I'd chosen my own path instead of following his plan for my life. When I graduated from Boston University with my marketing degree, he wanted me to come work for Thompson Construction like 3 generations of our family had done. Instead, I moved across the country to work for a tech startup in San Francisco. We'd fought about it for years. Every holiday dinner, every phone call. Somehow the conversation would circle back to how I was wasting my education, how I was abandoning family tradition. "You could be running this whole operation someday," he'd say, gesturing toward the business that built half the houses in our town. But I wanted something different, something that felt like mine. Now, sitting in our childhood kitchen with legal documents scattered across the same table where we used to do homework, I realized Dad's final message to me was crystal clear. He'd rewarded the son who stayed and punished the daughter who left. The unfairness of it burned in my chest. But what hurt more was understanding that this division would change everything between Michael and me forever. The funeral was 3 days later at St. Mary's, the same church where Michael and I were baptized. Half the town showed up because Dad had built homes for most of them over the past 30 years. People kept telling me how proud he was of me, how he always bragged about his daughter who worked with computers in California. The irony wasn't lost on me. After the burial, family and friends gathered at our house for the reception. Aunt Linda brought her famous apple pie, and Mrs. Henderson from next door made enough casseroles to feed an army. I found myself standing in the backyard, looking at the treehouse Dad built for us when I was 8. Michael found me there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "We need to figure this out," he said, handing me the warm mug. His face looked older somehow, like the weight of inheriting everything had aged him overnight. "This doesn't feel right, Sarah. Dad made a mistake." I wanted to believe him, but something nagged at me. "When exactly did you two talk about the will?" I asked, watching his expression carefully. Michael had always been terrible at hiding things from me. When we were kids, I could tell when he'd broken something or eaten the last cookie just by looking at his face. He sighed and sat down on the old wooden bench Dad had made from leftover lumber. "It was last Christmas, when you couldn't make it home because of that work project. Dad was upset, really upset. He kept saying how you'd chosen strangers over family, how nothing he built here mattered to you anymore." The memory hit me like a punch. I'd been leading a major product launch that required me to work through the holidays. I'd explained it to Dad over the phone, promised I'd visit in January instead, but he'd hung up on me. Michael had called later to smooth things over, said Dad would get over it, that he understood I had important responsibilities. That's when he asked me if I thought the business could survive another generation, Michael continued. He said he needed to make sure everything went to someone who'd actually take care of it. I thought he was just venting, you know? He was always dramatic when he got emotional. But you didn't tell me. The accusation came out sharper than I intended. Michael flinched like I'd slapped him. What was I supposed to say? That Dad was hurt you chose work over family again? You were already dealing with stress from your job, and I thought he'd change his mind once he calmed down. So you just let him write me out of our family legacy. I stood up, pacing toward the garden where Mom grew her tomatoes every summer. Do you know what this looks like, Mike? It looks like you encouraged him. That's not fair, Sarah. I never asked for this. His voice rose enough that I saw Mom glance toward us through the kitchen window. You think I wanted to be the only one responsible for keeping Dad's business alive? You think I wanted to inherit all this guilt along with the property? Guilt? I turned to face him. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you got everything while I got the message that I don't belong in this family. Michael stood up too, his coffee mug forgotten on the bench. You left, Sarah. You chose to leave. Every holiday, every family emergency, every time Dad needed help with something, you had an excuse. A conference, a deadline, a meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. What did you expect? His words stung, because there was truth in them. I had missed things. I had chosen my career over family gatherings more times than I cared to count. But hearing it from Michael, seeing the resentment that had apparently been building for years, felt like discovering that my own brother had been keeping score against me. I built something out there, I said quietly. I built a life that mattered to me. Just because it wasn't what Dad wanted doesn't make it wrong. I never said it was wrong, but you can't build something new and still expect to inherit something old. Dad needed to know his life's work would continue, and you made it clear that wasn't your priority. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. I had made choices that took me away from home, away from family traditions, away from the path Dad had laid out for me. But standing there in our backyard, looking at the house where we grew up, I realized that Michael had made choices too. He'd chosen to stay, to be the dutiful son, to let Dad believe that I cared less about family than I actually did. Neither of us had been completely honest. And now Dad was gone, leaving us to sort through the mess of expectations and disappointments he'd left behind. I stayed in Concord for 2 weeks, helping Mom sort through Dad's things and taking care of funeral arrangements. Michael went back to work after a few days, managing the construction crews and meeting with clients. The normalcy of his routine made me feel even more like an outsider looking in on a life I'd abandoned. One afternoon, while Mom was at the grocery store, I decided to clean out Dad's home office. He'd kept it exactly the same for 20 years. The same oak desk he'd bought when the business started turning a real profit. The same filing cabinet stuffed with contracts and blueprints. The same framed photo of me and Michael at my college graduation sitting next to his coffee mug. I found the legal documents in the bottom drawer, filed under estate planning. There were several drafts of the will, dating back almost 2 years. My hands shook as I read through them, seeing how Dad's intentions had evolved over time. The earliest version split everything equally between Michael and me. The second draft gave Michael the business, but left us both the properties. The final version, dated just 3 months before he died, was the one that cut me out almost entirely. But it wasn't the progression of the will that made my stomach drop. It was the notes Dad had written in the margins of each draft. Next to my name on the early versions, he'd written things like, Sarah's portion, make sure she has security, and enough for her to come home if she wants to. On the later drafts, the notes got harsher. She made her choice was scrawled next to one section. Mike deserves this, was written beside another. The most painful note was on the final version, written in Dad's careful handwriting across the top of the first page. Michael says she's happy out there and doesn't need our help anymore. I sat in Dad's leather chair, staring at those words until they blurred. Michael had been talking to Dad about me, feeding him information about my life in California, my job, my finances, and apparently, he'd convinced Dad that I was doing so well I didn't need any inheritance at all. My phone buzzed with a text from my boss asking when I'd be back in the office. I'd been avoiding calls from work, using bereavement leave to deal with family stuff, but I knew I couldn't stay away much longer. The irony wasn't lost on me. The success I'd built in California, the career Dad resented, was now the reason I could afford to take time off to grieve him. I called Michael, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later with the same result. Finally, I drove to the construction site where his truck was parked. I found him in the trailer that served as the office, reviewing blueprints with 2 of Dad's longtime employees. "I need to talk to you," I said from the doorway. The workers looked between us, sensing tension, and Michael dismissed them with a nod. "What's wrong now?" he asked, not looking up from the plans spread across his desk. I placed the will drafts in front of him, watching his face as he recognized what they were. When Dad asked about my situation in California, "What exactly did you tell him?" Michael's jaw tightened. He shuffled through the papers, seeing Dad's handwritten notes, seeing the evidence of conversations I'd never been part of. I told him the truth, that you had a good job, that you seemed happy with your choices. You told him I didn't need help. You told him I was fine on my own. I pointed to Dad's note at the top of the final will. "This is your opinion, not Dad's. Sarah, I was trying to protect you. Every time Dad brought up money or the inheritance, he'd get angry about how you never asked the family for anything. He saw it as rejection, like you thought you were too good for what he could offer. So instead of explaining that I was being independent, not rejecting him, you decided to let him think I didn't want to be part of this family anymore?" Michael finally looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in my brother's eyes before. Shame mixed with defensiveness. "You don't understand what it was like being here with him every day, listening to him worry about whether you even cared about us anymore. I was trying to make peace. By sacrificing my relationship with Dad? By letting him die thinking I'd chosen money and success over family?" My voice cracked on the last word. "You did choose those things, Sarah. Maybe not over family, but you chose them first, always. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you can't have it both ways. You can't build a life somewhere else and still expect to inherit like you never left." The construction site was quiet, except for the sound of hammering from the house they were building nearby. I looked around the trailer at the familiar chaos of Dad's business. The coffee-stained paperwork, the hard hats hanging on hooks, the photos of completed projects covering every wall. This had been his world, and Michael's world, and I'd never really been part of it. But that didn't mean I deserved to be erased from it completely, and it didn't mean Michael had the right to speak for me in conversations that would determine my father's final judgment of my life. That evening, I asked Mom to sit down with Michael and me in the living room. She'd been tiptoeing around the tension between us for days, probably hoping we'd work it out on our own like we did when we were kids fighting over toys or television channels. But this wasn't something that would blow over with time. Mom settled into Dad's recliner, the one he'd claimed for 30 years, and folded her hands in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, like grief had shrunk her. "What's this about, honey?" she asked, though I could tell from her expression she already knew. I placed the will drafts on the coffee table between us. "Did you know Dad rewrote his will 3 times in the past 2 years? Her face went pale as she reached for the papers with shaking hands. She read through them slowly, her lips moving silently as she absorbed Dad's progression from fairness to favoritism. When she got to his handwritten notes, she made a small sound that was part gasp, part sob. "He never told me about these conversations with Michael," she said quietly. "He just said he was updating things to make sure the business stayed in the family." She looked at Michael, who was sitting stiffly on the couch, his hands clenched in his lap. "What conversations, Mike?" Michael cleared his throat, looking everywhere except at Mom's face. "Dad would ask me about Sarah sometimes, how she was doing, whether she seemed happy in California, if she ever talked about missing home. I told him what I thought he wanted to hear." "Which was what exactly?" Mom's voice had an edge I rarely heard, the same tone she used when we were teenagers, and she caught us lying about where we'd been. That she was successful and independent, that she didn't need anything from us. Michael's voice got quieter with each word. Dad would get so worked up about how she never called just to chat, how she always had some excuse for missing holidays. I thought if I told him she was happy and secure, he'd stop worrying about it. Mom set the papers down carefully, like they might crumble if she handled them too roughly. So instead of encouraging him to reach out to his daughter, you let him believe she didn't want to be reached. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. I watched Michael struggle with an answer, seeing him realize that his attempts to protect everyone had actually made everything worse. I was trying to keep peace, he said finally. Every time Sarah's name came up, Dad would get upset. He'd start talking about how he failed as a father, how he pushed her away by wanting her to follow his path. I thought if I made it sound like she'd chosen her independence, he wouldn't feel so guilty about it. But that guilt was important, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. That guilt meant he still cared, still wanted a relationship with me. When you took that away, you took away his reason to try. Mom nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Your father always regretted the fights you two had about the business. He told me once that he wished he'd been more supportive of your dreams instead of trying to force you into his plans. This was news to me. In all our arguments, Dad had never backed down, never admitted that maybe I had a right to choose my own path. He said that many times, especially after you got that promotion last year. He was proud of you, Sarah, but he didn't know how to tell you without admitting he'd been wrong about everything else. Mom's eyes filled with tears. He was stubborn just like you. Neither one of you knew how to apologize. I felt something break loose in my chest, a knot of resentment and hurt that had been growing tighter for years. Dad had been proud of me. He'd regretted our fights. But Michael's well-intentioned lies had convinced him that I'd moved beyond needing his approval or his love. This can't stand, Mom said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since Dad died. This will doesn't reflect what your father really wanted. It reflects his hurt feelings and bad information. She looked directly at Michael. You know it's not right, don't you? Michael nodded miserably. I never wanted this much. I never wanted Sarah to get nothing. I just wanted Dad to stop being angry all the time. Then we fix it, Mom said, with the same determination she'd used to settle our childhood disputes. We make this right, but I wasn't sure it could be fixed. The hurt went deeper than money or property. It was about years of misunderstood conversations, missed opportunities to bridge the gap between Dad's expectations and my choices. Even if Michael gave me half of everything tomorrow, it wouldn't change the fact that Dad had died thinking I didn't care about the family he'd spent his life building. Michael and I spent the next morning at the lawyer's office, sitting across from Mr. Peterson, who'd handled Dad's legal affairs for 15 years. The old man's office smelled like leather and coffee, with law books lining every wall and family photos covering his desk. He'd known us since we were kids, had drawn up the papers when Dad bought his first work truck. Technically, the will is valid, Mr. Peterson explained, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the documents. Your father was of sound mind when he made these changes, and he followed all the proper procedures. But that doesn't mean it can't be modified through mutual agreement. Michael shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him. What would that look like? Well, Michael inherited the bulk of the estate, so he has the legal right to redistribute portions to Sarah if he chooses. We could draw up a transfer of assets, or create a partnership arrangement for the properties. Mr. Peterson looked between us carefully. But these decisions need to come from genuine agreement, not family pressure. I appreciated that he was giving Michael an out, a way to keep everything if he really wanted to. But I also knew my brother well enough to see the conflict playing across his face. The Michael I grew up with had always been fair, sometimes to a fault. He was the kid who'd split his Halloween candy with me even when I'd eaten all of mine too fast. After we left the lawyer's office, we drove to the lake cottage in silence. It was October, and the New Hampshire woods were blazing with fall colors. The cottage looked exactly the same as it had every summer of our childhood. Weathered cedar shingles, a wraparound porch, and the old dock stretching into the water where Dad had taught us both to fish. We sat on the porch steps, looking out at the lake, where a few die-hard fishermen were trying their luck despite the chilly weather. This place held our best family memories. Barbecues where Dad would burn the hamburgers while telling stories about his construction mishaps. Late-night board game tournaments when it rained. Swimming competitions that Michael always won until I got tall enough to give him real competition. I used to think you were crazy for leaving all this, Michael said, picking up a handful of fallen leaves and letting them drift through his fingers. The lake, the town, the business Dad built. It seemed like throwing away something precious. "And now?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time, watching a loon dive for fish near the opposite shore. "Now I think maybe you were braver than I was. I stayed because it was safe, because I knew exactly what was expected of me. You left because you wanted something more. I didn't leave to hurt Dad, or to reject what he built here." The words came out more quietly than I intended. "I left because I needed to know who I was when I wasn't just Bob Thompson's daughter. I get that now, but Dad never did, and I never helped him understand it." Michael turned to look at me directly. "I made it worse by letting him think you'd outgrown us instead of explaining that you were just growing in a different direction." A pair of ducks landed on the water near our dock, sending ripples across the reflection of the mountains. This conversation felt like something we should have had years ago, back when there was still time to fix things with Dad. "What do you want to do about the will?" I asked. Michael stood up and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with both hands. "I want to split the cottage with you. This place belongs to both of us. All our best memories are here." He paused, then continued. "The house in Concord should stay with Mom for now, but when she's gone, we split that too. And I want to give you a partnership stake in the business, even if you never work in it. It's part of our family history. Mike, you don't have to do this just because you feel guilty. I'm not doing it because I feel guilty, though I do feel guilty." He turned around to face me. "I'm doing it because it's what Dad would have wanted if he'd known the truth about how you felt about us. He thought you'd moved on from being a Thompson, but you never did. You just became a Thompson in a different place." The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the porch, and I could hear the gentle lapping of water against the dock. This place had always felt like the heart of our family, the spot where we were most ourselves without the pressures of school or work or expectations. "There's one condition," I said. "I want to help you modernize the business, bring it into the digital age, maybe expand beyond just residential construction. Dad always said he wanted Thompson Construction to last for generations, but that won't happen if we don't adapt." Michael's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since Dad died. "You want to work with me? Not full-time and not from here, but remotely as a consultant. Marketing, business development, maybe help you build a website that doesn't look like it was designed in 1995. I grinned back at him. We could be partners after all, just not the way Dad originally planned. 6 months later, I was back in Concord for the official signing of our partnership agreement. The Thompson Construction website had just gone live, featuring photos of Dad's work alongside Michael's newer projects. We'd landed 3 major contracts since launching our online presence, including a custom home for a tech executive who found us through Google. Mom had insisted on hosting dinner afterward, making Dad's favorite pot roast recipe even though none of us particularly loved it. She'd been different since our family meeting, more involved in both our lives, as if Dad's death had reminded her not to take our relationships for granted. She called me every Sunday now, and our conversations had evolved beyond the polite updates we used to exchange. "Your father would be amazed by all this," she said, scrolling through the company's new Instagram account on her phone. She'd learned social media faster than Michael had, posting progress photos of construction projects and before and after shots that our followers loved. He always said the business needed young ideas, but he was too stubborn to ask for help. Michael raised his wine glass. To Dad, who would probably complain about us using computers for everything, but would be proud that we're still building things that last. We drank to that, but the toast felt incomplete somehow. There was still a dad-shaped hole in our family dynamic. Still moments when one of us would start to call him about a business decision or family news, before remembering he wasn't there to answer. Later that evening, Michael and I walked through the old neighborhood, past houses Dad had built throughout the 1990s. Most of them still looked solid and well-maintained, testimony to his insistence on quality materials and careful craftsmanship. We stopped in front of the Morrison house, where Dad had let me help paint the shutters when I was 12. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd had that conversation while Dad was still alive?" I asked. Michael kicked at a loose stone on the sidewalk. "Every day. But maybe we weren't ready for it then. Maybe we needed to lose him to understand what we were really fighting about." "What do you think we were fighting about?" "Whether there was room in this family for different kinds of success." He gestured toward the houses around us. Dad measured everything by what you could build with your hands, what you could leave behind that people could see and touch. Your kind of success didn't make sense to him because it wasn't physical. I thought about my work in California, the software products I'd helped develop, the teams I'd managed, the strategies I'd created that had helped companies grow. None of it would last the way these houses would last. But it had value too, in its own way. The funny thing is, what I do out there isn't that different from what Dad did here, I said. We both build things from nothing. We both solve problems for people. We both take pride in work that makes a difference. He just couldn't see past the tools we used. We'd reached the end of the street, where it curved toward the elementary school we'd both attended. The playground had been updated since our time there, but the old oak tree where we used to climb was still standing, its branches reaching toward the streetlights. "I have something for you," Michael said, pulling a small wrapped box from his jacket pocket. "I found it in Dad's workshop last week, in the drawer where he kept his good measuring tape." Inside the box was a bracelet made from bent nails and wire, the kind of jewelry a craftsman might make for his daughter when she was small. I recognized it immediately. Dad had made it for me when I was 7, after I'd spent a day following him around a job site asking endless questions about construction. I'd worn it constantly until I outgrew it, then forgotten about it completely. "He kept it all these years," I whispered, sliding it onto my wrist. It was too small now, but it fit perfectly over the watch I wore to important meetings in California. "There was a note with it," Michael said, handing me a piece of paper folded small. "He wrote it but never gave it to you." I unfolded the note carefully, recognizing Dad's careful handwriting. "For Sarah, who builds dreams the same way I build houses, with patience, determination, and love. I'm proud of what you've created, even if I don't always understand it." Standing under that old oak tree, holding a piece of jewelry made from construction scraps, and a note that proved my father had understood me better than either of us realized, I finally felt like I could breathe completely. The inheritance dispute had never really been about money or property. It had been about belonging, about whether there was space in our family story for the choices I'd made. Now I knew there was. Dad had kept my bracelet and written that note because, despite all our arguments, he'd never stopped seeing me as his daughter. The will had been written in hurt and misunderstanding, but his heart had held on to something truer. Michael and I had found our way back to each other, and in doing so, we'd found our way back to the father who'd raised us both to be builders, just in different ways.